Have you ever sat down to play a game just for a few minutes only to look up and realize hours have passed? Or perhaps you felt that rush of satisfaction when finally defeating a challenging boss after dozens of attempts. These experiences aren't accidents. They are carefully engineered psychological responses crafted through intentional design choices. Today, we are diving deep into the fascinating intersection of game design and psychology, exploring how developers create systems specifically designed to engage our minds and emotions. Games have evolved from simple entertainment into sophisticated experience engines. As game designer Tynan Sylvester writes in his seminal work Designing Games, successful games are engines of experience that generate emotional responses through carefully constructed systems. Today, we'll explore the psychological principles that make games so uniquely engaging, from the neurochemistry of reward systems to the social psychology of player communities. We'll analyze how games create and maintain flow states, the psychology behind different reward mechanisms, how player agency affects emotional investments, the deliberate crafting of emotional experiences, the social psychology driving multiplayer engagement, the neuroscience behind gaming's effect on the brain, ethical considerations in psychological game design. By understanding these principles, we gain a deeper appreciation for games as both art and science, because the best game designers are in many ways applied psychologists. Before we start, if you enjoyed the videos, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. It helps immensely. In 1975, psychologists Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi introduced the concept of flow, a mental state of complete absorption and enjoyment in an activity. Flow occurs when we engage in tasks that perfectly balance challenge against our skill levels, creating a channel where we are neither bored nor frustrating. Sounds familiar? It should, because game designers have been perfecting this science of flow for decades. When we are in flow, several psychological changes occur. Our sense of time distorts, self-consciousness disappears, we feel a sense of control, action and awareness merge, and we experience intrinsic rewards. Game designers create flow by carefully calibrating difficulty curves. Consider From Software's Dark Souls series, famous for its punishing difficulty. As psychologist Jamie Madigan explains in The Engagement Game, these titles keep players in flow not through accessibility but through fair difficulty, challenges that feel conquerable with skills and persistence. The developers create what psychologists call a manageable difficulty, hard enough to engage but not so hard as to create hopelessness. This gives players in what researcher Genoa Chan termed the flow channel, that sweet spot between anxiety and boredom. This principle applies across genres. Tetris, for example, increases speed incrementally as player skill improves. Battle royale games like Fortnite use matchmaking algorithms to pair players with similar skill levels. Racing games offer gradually more challenging tracks and opponents. The neurochemistry behind flow is fascinating. Research by cognitive scientists like Douglas Gentile shows that flow states trigger dopamine release, creating enjoyment and altering our brain chemistry. This dopamine response reinforces continued play, creating what psychologists call intrinsic motivation. We play because the activity itself is rewarding, not just for external rewards. The indie platformer Celeste provides a masterclass in flow state design. Its core mechanic, precise platforming with instant restarts after failure, creates what game scholars call micro-flow loops. Players can immediately retry challenges with minimal frustration, keeping them engaged despite high difficulty. What is particularly notable is how Celeste's optional assist mode allows players to customize difficulty parameters, game speed, air dashes, and invincibility, creating personalized flow channels. This approach demonstrates an evolution in flow design, letting players participate in calibrating their own experience. Regarding rewards, game designers are masters of behavior psychology, specifically reinforcement schedules. The godfather of this field, Burrhus Frederick Skinner, discovered that variable ratio reinforcement, unpredictable rewards after varying numbers of actions, creates the strongest and most persistent behavior. You've seen this in action if you've ever opened the loot box in Overwatch, farmed for rare drop in Diablo, pulled the lever on a slot machine mechanic. As game researcher Nikki documented in his Quantum Foundry research, variable rewards are particularly effective because they trigger anticipatory pleasure. We enjoy the possibility of reward almost as much as the reward itself. But games employ more than just randomized rewards. Game design psychologist Jamie Madigan identifies several reward structures working together in modern games. The first one is achievement rewards, completing defined goals like trophies, achievements, etc. The second one is sustenance rewards, resources needed for continued play. Third one is social rewards, recognition from other players. And the fourth one is glory rewards, visible status symbols like badges, medals, etc. Each one of those taps into different psychological needs. Achievement rewards satisfy our needs for competence and mastery. Social rewards fulfill our needs for connection and status. As researcher Richard Ryan found in his self-determination theory research, games that satisfy these basic psychological needs create the most engaging player bases. These reward structures are often layered to create what psychologists call compulsion loops, cycles of tension and release that keep players engaged. Game designer Ralph Koster described these as the atoms of fun, small, rewarding feedback loops that drive continuous engagement. Modern games often implement what behavioral economists call progressive disclosure of rewards, gradually revealing new reward systems as players advance. Consider how Monster Hunter World gradually introduces its complex crafting system, or how Persona 5 unlocks new social mechanics over its first 10 hours. This layered approach prevents cognitive overload while continuously introducing new motivation systems. Brian Jeffrey Fogg's behavior model suggests that motivation peaks when new challenges appears, just as mastery of previous systems is achieved, something games like Civilization have perfected through their tech tree progressions. Beyond reward systems, games create psychological engagement through player agency, the sense that our decisions matter. As Tynan Sylvester writes in Designing Games, meaningful choices are those whose outcomes a player can understand and care about. The psychology here is fascinating. Researchers like Rigby and Ryan have found that perceived autonomy, the feeling that we are making meaningful choices, is a core psychological need that games can satisfy. But there is an important distinction between actual and perceived agency. Many narrative games create what designers Sid Meier calls the illusion of choice, branching paths that eventually converge, creating the feeling of consequence without requiring exponentially more content. The Telltale game series like The Walking Dead famously use this technique. While major plot points remain fixed, the game will tell players Clementine will remember that after certain choices, creating powerful emotional investment even those choices had limited gameplay impact. This works because of what psychologists call the narrative fallacy, our tendency to create meaningful stories from disconnected events. As cognitive scientist Kate Oatley has shown, emotional investment in stories comes not just from outcomes but from our senses of participation in the narrative process. Decision psychology also explains why games with too many options can fatigue decision-making. Barry Schwartz's research on paradox of choice suggests that too many options can overwhelm rather than empower. This is why successful RPGs like Disco Elysium limit skill trees to meaningful, character-defining choices rather than endless minor statistical adjustments. Games offer two distinct forms of agency. As seen in narrative games like The Last of Us, authored agency carefully guides players through predetermined emotional beats while creating the feeling of choice. Procedural agency, as seen in sandbox games like Minecraft, provides systems that respond to player choices in emergent ways. Both approaches satisfy our psychological need for autonomy, but through different mechanisms. As game researcher Gordon Kalea explains in his player involvement model, authored agency creates narrative involvement through identification with characters, while procedural agency creates ludic involvement through system mastery. The most compelling games often blend both approaches, as seen in titles like Breath of the Wild. Beyond creating engaging systems, many games deliberately craft specific emotional experiences. This approach aligns perfectly with Celeste's Engines of Experience framework, where he argues that games should be built around the emotions they aim to evoke, not just mechanical systems. The game Journey, for example, was explicitly designed to evoke feelings of smallness, wonder, and connection. Designer Genoa Chan used what he called emotional curve design, deliberately pacing the game to create specific emotional trajectory. Psychologist Catherine Isbesta's research on how games move us identifies several emotional design techniques. First one, embodied empathy, physical mirroring between player and avatar movements. The second one, visceral feedback, tactile sensation through controllers. The third one, social emotions, feelings evoked through in-game relationships. And the fourth one, mood management, using aesthetic to shift emotional states. These techniques work because they engage what neuroscientists call embodied cognition, the idea that our emotions aren't just in our heads but experienced through our bodies. When we tense up during a stealth sequence in The Last of Us, our bodies are physically experiencing the anxiety the game wants us to convey. Game designers also use music and visual design to trigger emotional responses. The field of psychoacoustics explains how certain sound frequencies can evoke specific emotional responses, something composers like Nobuo Uematsu, the composer of Final Fantasy, and Koji Kondo, the composer of Mario and Zelda series, have mastered. While early games primarily targeted excitement and achievement, modern titles deliberately craft more nuanced emotional palettes. The Last Guardian creates tender protection instincts toward Trico. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice uses binaural audio to simulate psychosis. Papers, Please evoke moral conflict through mechanical tension. This emotional sophistication reflects the medium's maturation. As game designer Genoa Chan notes, games have mastered the excitement, but we are just beginning to explore other emotional territories. Research by psychologist Jun Pristagni suggests that the more complex emotional experiences create deeper, more memorable engagement than simple pleasure or achievements. Many games leverage social psychology principles to create engagement. As social creatures, humans are uniquely motivated by connection, status, and group belonging. Researchers like Nick Yee have identified several social motivations in games. First one is competition, desire to challenge and dominate others. The second one is cooperation, pleasure in working together towards shared goals. Third one, recognition, validation from peers and the community. And the fourth one, belonging, sense of group membership and identity. MMO designers like those behind World of Warcraft intentionally create independent player roles, forcing cooperation that builds social bonds. Research by Nicholas Tochenau and Robert Moore shows that these enforced interactions often lead to genuine friendship formation outside the game. Meanwhile, competitive games leverage what social psychologists call social comparison theory, our tendency to evaluate ourselves with others. This explains the appeal of leaderboard, ranking, and visual status symbols like rare skins or titles. Game theorist Jane McGonigal argues that these social dynamics don't just make games engaging, they can build real-world skills and connections. Her research suggests that the problem-solving and collaboration skills developed in multiplayer games can transfer to the real-world contexts. An emerging area of gaming psychology examines what researchers call parasocial relationships, one-sided emotional connection with fictional characters. Games like Mass Effect and Persona create powerful parasocial bonds due to their authored narrative and player agency combinations. Research by communications scholar Jamie Banks suggests these parasocial relationships fulfill genuine psychological needs, particularly during social isolation. This explains why many players report genuine grief when completing character-driven narratives. These relationships activate the same neural pathways as real social connections. Recent advances in neuroscience have allowed researchers to directly observe brain activity during gameplay, revealing fascinating insights about how games affect our neural circuitry. Neuroscientist Daphne Bavellier's research using functional MRI scans shows that action games activate networks in the brain associated with attention, visual processing, and decision-making. Regular players of action games show increased activity in these regions even outside gameplay context, suggesting long-term neural adaptation. These findings challenge outdated notions that gaming is passive entertainment, as neuroscientist Adam Gazzaley explains in his research on the cognition crisis. Certain game types create measurable improvements in visual attention networks, task switching capabilities, working memory function, and rapid decision-making. Different game genres activate distinct neural pathways. Strategy games like Civilization primarily engage the prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and executive function. Horror games like Resident Evil strongly activate the amygdala, or fear processing center. Role-playing games engage the default mode network associated with empathy and perspective taking. Neuroscience research is revealing how games affect different age groups uniquely. Studies by neuropsychologist Hannah Kirk show that children still developing prefrontal cortex make them particularly susceptible to reward mechanisms. Meanwhile, research from the Games for Health project demonstrates that seniors who play cognitive training games show increased gray matter volume in the hippocampal region associated with memory. These findings suggest that age-appropriate game design should consider developmental neuroscience, calibrating challenge, reward frequency, and social dynamics to match the neural development of target players. While understanding gaming psychology can create meaningful experiences, this principle can be implemented in potential harmful ways. Game ethicist Miguel Sicard defines dark patterns as design elements that prioritize business interests over player well-beings. Common dark patterns include fear of missing out, or FOMO, which is limited time events that create artificial urgency, pay to win, which is mechanics that advantage paying players over skilled players, grinding wars, which is artificial difficulty spikes designed to encourage monetization, social pressure, which is using social comparison to drive spending or engagement, and hidden information, which is deliberately obscuring odds in randomized rewards. These approaches work precisely because they leverage or discuss psychological principles without ethical considerations. As game researcher Sebastian de Terding argues, the same psychological levers that create flow can create compulsion when misapplied. The industry response to these concerns has been uneven. While some companies like Electronic Arts and Epic Games have begun publishing drop rates for loot boxes, many major publishers continue implementing problematic mechanics without transparency. Companies like Activision Blizzard, Ubisoft, and numerous mobile game developers continue to rely heavily on aggressive monetization tactics without meaningful reform. In Diablo Immortal's case, analysts estimated it would cost players over $100,000 to max out a character through microtransactions fully. On the regulatory front, Belgium and Netherlands have classified specific loot box mechanics as illegal gambling, while Japan and China have implemented strict disclosure requirements. However, in many major markets, including the United States, regulations remain minimal, allowing companies to self-regulate with little accountability. Industry trade groups have generally opposed legislative solutions, arguing for voluntary guidelines that critics describe as insufficient. Understanding these mechanisms create awareness for players, leading to healthier engagement. Recognizing when a game is creating artificial urgency or leveraging social comparison can help us make more deliberate choices about our gaming habits. As we've seen, the psychology of gaming isn't just about clever manipulation. It is about understanding fundamental human needs and creating systems that fulfill them. The best games aren't just fun. They are sophisticated psychological experiences that engage our minds in complex ways. Tynan Sylvester's concept of games as engines of experience perfectly captures this understanding. Successful game design isn't just about graphics or gameplay mechanics, it is about crafting systems that reliably generate meaningful emotional responses. Understanding the psychology behind game design gives us a deeper appreciation for games as an art form. We recognize that the satisfaction of finally beating a difficulty boss isn't just about gameplay but the psychological journey of persistence and mastery. The connection we form in online communities aren't just about convenience but fundamental human needs for belonging. As games evolve, we see increasing diversity in their psychological experiences, from games explicitly designed for cognitive training to titles exploring complex emotional territories like grief, loneliness, and personal growth. The psychological horizons of gaming continue to expand. Next time you find yourself lost in a game, take a moment to appreciate the psychological craftsmen at work. Consider how the game balances challenge and skill to create flow, structures rewards to maintain engagement, gives you meaningful agency, evokes specific emotions, or creates social connections. Because understanding how games work on our minds doesn't diminish their magic. It enhances our appreciation for their artistry.